Good evening. We're glad you're with us tonight. An emotional plea from a family in search of a loved one. Law enforcement in western North Carolina arresting Philip Stroop early this morning in McDowell County after a day 6 manhunt. Deputies found him in a car belonging to a missing 68-year-old named Thomas Bryson.
Bryson's family says he was on his way to pick up his sister for a doctor's appointment, but never made it.
I met the deputy coming down the road, and I assumed that he was just patrolling the area, and that's when he told me that my father was missing, and you know, your heart sinks.
Well, I remember those days that Dad was missing. You know, we had all the friends and family at the house, and it literally looked like something from a movie. Like, it's hard to even explain. Like, you don't imagine something like this happening to your life. You know, you have to pinch yourself and say, is this really happening? And I'll never forget, on the 26th of July, the sheriff of Harrison County at the time pulled up. I mean, we were up 4 days straight, couldn't sleep. And I remember he came up the driveway a little after midnight, and he told us that my dad had been found, but unfortunately he wasn't alive. My dad and I were extremely close. My dad taught me everything that I knew, you know, how to ride a bike, how to shoot a basketball, how to field dress a deer, just everything a boy needs to know. As I got older and I got married and had children, our relationship just blossomed, and I can honestly say that he was my best friend in this world. My family was wonderful. They raised us the way Christ would want children to be raised, and my dad and I just had a really, really close bond. You know, when as an adult, you expect your parents are going to pass away one day, and you know that day's coming, but never like that. Never like that do you anticipate something like that happening. And I remember it was almost like you're just in shock for days. And it was actually, believe it or not, it was hard to cry. I think after the funeral, you know, it really hit home when, you know, you take your dad's ashes and you have to bury him. And you have to talk at the graveside by your father who was kidnapped and murdered. It's just something you don't ever anticipate having to do. And I think that's when, for me, the confusion and anger really set in for me. The hardest thing for me is I know I was not a very good father during that time. I know that my kids saw a side of me that they'd never seen, especially my oldest son, who at the time I was a basketball coach. And my son, unfortunately, got to see a side of me that was not good. When I would get angry when I was coaching, it was the anger at God that was coming out. It was the anger at this guy who killed my dad, and I couldn't filter it. And it would come out in just horrible ways, and just, I would lash out at my players, I'd lash out at my son, and when I come home, I knew I was short with my family, and I'd lash out at them, and I wasn't a good person.
The biggest thing I saw at first was anger. And I also remember our son, who played basketball for him, coming in the house and being very emotional. And I would look at him and I'd say, "Are you okay?" And he would say, I just don't like Dad right now." And that was hard. That was really hard. And I knew my husband was dealing with a lot of anger. And our kids were also walking through a lot of just trying to process everything that had happened. And that was hard.
I didn't want any part of God. I didn't want any part of anything. You know, I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up a Christ follower, and I remember going to church. You know, we were active members at Biltmore, but I remember sit there and listen to Pastor Bruce, and he'd open the Word up, and to me, I could look at the Bible and it was just blank. The worship songs would just go right through me like I was an apparition. Nothing, just completely no feeling whatsoever. And this went on for years. I don't know if it's human nature or what, but you begin to question God's existence. And you want to tell yourself, no way a loving God could let something like this happen to my dad. I remember I had a dream about my dad that I'll never forget. I was in this complete dark room, and I was just walking, and I could see a tiny little light at the end of this tunnel. And I know it sounds cliche because everyone talks about when they die or whatever, they see the light. So this was real. The closer and closer I get to the light, I could see a person standing there. And as I got closer and closer, I could see the person was dressed in all white. He turned around and looked at me, and it was my dad. And I know it was him because I remember growing up, We had this really cheesy 1980s photo on our mantle growing up. And I remember my dad had his beard and his long sideburns, you know, and he was probably about 35 years old or so, I don't know. But I remember in that dream, when I got closer to him, he turned around and he looked right at me, and it was the exact face from that picture. And I remember he looked at me and he just walked over to me and he put his arms around me and he said, son, I love you, and I'm gonna see you soon. And I woke up. And I remember telling my wife, I said, I had this dream about Dad, and just confirmed that heaven was real. It was real, and he's there. You know, all this stuff he told me my whole life, and what he was teaching my brother and I, even my mom, like it was real. And I think that was one of the first steps to me understanding that God is real and that you're gonna get through this.
It was in that moment that God revealed himself to him. He had always been there, but he revealed himself and said, you know, Joe, I'm still here. I haven't walked away, and your dad is good. Your dad is really good, and he loves you, and he wants you to enjoy your life. And it was definitely a turning point for our family.
And I remember from that day on, I had a different perspective. You know, how blessed I was to have a wonderful, loving wife who, God bless her, if it wasn't for her, I couldn't have got through this. And I remember looking at my kids differently and just seeing what a blessing my kids were and what a blessing my mom and my brother were. And I just started to get overwhelmed with the blessings in my life. And then I started feeling guilty. It's like, who am I to be angry at God when I can see all the blessings around me? Well, you know, it says in Psalms 34:18 that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. And for the longest time, I never could see that or feel that, but he was always there for me. But I feel like I've become a better husband. I've become a better father. I ended up resigning from coaching, which was absolutely the best thing I ever did, because now I could focus all of my attention on supporting my kids and being there with them. And I found my wife and I's prayer life has definitely changed for the better. You know, I want to be like my dad. My dad was my hero. You know, I want to raise my kids like he raised my brother and I. For the longest time, I said, you know, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God why. But now, as years have gone by, it's been 6 years now, and as you walk through this, now there's no way I'm going to ask God why, because I know when I get to heaven, I'm not going to care. I'm not going to care. I want to leave a legacy behind. I want to raise our children to be God-fearing Christ followers like my dad taught us. Your trials in life have an expiration date, but God's love and faithfulness does not.